My name is Steve Elzy. I'm with KRML Radio and Your Sanctuary Television. I want to thank you all for being here today. This is really sort of an historic day. We have scientists and historians and speakers from all across the country, and a lot of them are internationally renowned. So you're in for a treat if you haven't seen anything yet, and if you've seen it already, you're in for more of a treat. So I want to thank the sponsors. A little housekeeping first. A few of our sponsors are the Fisherman's Wharf Association, the Wecker Group, who does a great job with our graphics, Pepsi, and Monterey Waves Magazine. That's a new magazine that's around. Our next speaker, Tim Thomas, has actually researched the Monterey Bay sardine industry and fishing industry for over 25 years, and he knows a lot more about a lot more things too. His knowledge has wide scope. Most recently, he appeared on Big Blue Live. I don't know if any of you caught that. It was a BBC PBS production, huge. In fact, it was so big that people from the UK started coming over here and going whale watching, which we, of course, love. So Tim also gives historic walking tours. I think he calls them wharf walks. And he'll be doing a few of those during the Whale Fest. And also, well, he can tell you when he does them during the rest of the time. So please, a warm welcome for Tim Thomas.
Appreciate it. So it's a small but informative group, I can tell. So a little bit again about me. I actually was the historian and curator for this museum, the old Maritime Museum. Those of you remember that, for about 16 years. And I've written a couple of books about the Monterey waterfront. One you can pick up after the talk there in the store there called The Abalone King of Monterey. I've actually given numerous talks in this room. I can't tell you how many I've given in this room here. And and those guys in the camera, I have a hard time. I know it's going to be difficult being confined behind these little podiums here. So I tend to move around a little bit, and I'll do my best to do what I can. All right, so as you see the talk, it's not really a history of the sardine fishery per se. That would take us a long time, but really kind of a history, some things that you may not know about the Monterey sardine fishery in particular. And there's a lot of myths about the Monterey sardine fishery. One, that those fishermen and those cannery owners are all greedy and all for, and they only did to make all kinds of money, and they depleted the sardine fishery out there, which isn't necessarily the case that happened out there. It's a much more complicated story than that. In fact, there were a number of these cannery owners who were not so greedy and who actually sort of saw the future, and I'll try to talk about that in this little talk here. But we'll give us a little history here, see if this does. I'm not very mechanical. I don't even drive a car, so hope this does what it's supposed to do here. All right, so, wrong way, Tim. There you see, I didn't even start on the right foot. All right, there we go. So just to give us a little brief history here, get us to this oil story. Of course, Portuguese Whalers. This is a wonderful illustration done by a guy named Charles Scammon in Monterey Bay, 1875 or so, of Portuguese whalers, guys from the Azores. And they're hunting gray whales and humpback whales out there. And of course, they're after oil. That's what they're after, the oil that was in the blubber. And that's what that whaling industry was all about. It was about oil. These guys are coming here, and those big whaling stories, anybody read Moby Dick? I mean, that's that story. That was before there was petroleum oil on the market. That's the oil that this country really needed. They needed this whale oil, which is used to burn in lamps and to lubricate machinery parts. In the 19th century, almost all lighthouses relied on whale oil as its light source. And that's what they were doing here in Monterey. These guys are all products of the California Gold Rush. These guys are all big whaling ships out of Nantucket and New Bedford. And these guys go around the Cape Horn hunting whales all the way up to Alaska and all the way across the Pacific into Japan. And they actually wouldn't return home until they filled the whole of their whaling ship with whale oil, which could take sometimes up to 5 years until you got home. But something happened in California in 1848. Gold was discovered on the American River, and all these ships came into San Francisco. I mean, let's face it. Let's say we were all part of a whaling crew out of Nantucket. Had to smell dead whale every single day for the last 5 years, and they told there's gold up hills for taking. What are you going to do? Heck with that whaling. I'm getting me some of that gold. And that's exactly what these Azorean whalers did. We got to those gold fields, though. They found out that it wasn't as easy as they were told. So he said, the heck with that. I'd rather be whaling. Go back to San Francisco. But they have no money because they didn't get any gold. And they had no way to get home because everyone had abandoned their ship. So they were kind of stuck. So around 1854 or so, 17 guys are sitting on a pier in San Francisco. One guy goes, I'm going to go by Monterey. Sure can look like home, and there are a lot of whales down there. So he might have gone to San Francisco, set up a whaling station right over here by the Monterey Wharf, and began whaling what they called the old-fashioned way, in little teeny 28-foot boats, 6 guys in a boat. Can you imagine hunting a 100-foot blue whale in a little teeny boat like that? Hoo-wee. So these guys are getting mostly grays and humpbacks. This is a photograph taken on the beach just adjacent to the Monterey Wharf before the railroad went in. There was actually a beach there at one time. And then the railroad came in after 1880 and sort of blasted all that out to put that right away in. And so, but there are still remnants of this whaling industry down there on that beach, which I talk about on my walking tours. But as I said, you guys getting grays and humpbacks. California gray will produce about 40 barrels of whale oil. A barrel in those days was 36 gallons. 1870, a gallon of whale oil was selling for about $1.50 a gallon. I mean, that was a lot of money. In today's dollars, that's about $12,000. That was a lot of money. But these guys are actually losing more whales than they ever got. So they really weren't making that much money at it. And so it was always a kind of a part-time thing. Then in 1874, kerosene comes on the market and totally changed this industry. It did operate until about turn of the 20th century, off and on. There was actually one company that operated strictly for tourists that were coming to Monterey and loved to watch these guys get dragged through the bay by those whales out there. And of course, in 1919, California Sea Products Company opened their whaling station up in Moss Landing. And by that point, those guys were very efficient at what they did. They had these big steam-powered boats with whale cannons, and they were really good at what they did. In fact, they tie in a little bit to our sardine story. So California Sea Products, which was a Norwegian company, they actually came to Monterey about 1915, proposing to open a whaling station here on the Monterey side. Actually went out to Point Lobos and proposed this idea to A.M. Allen and Janosuke Kadani, who were running the abalone business out there. And they said, no, we're not interested in having a whaling station out here. So they came over here to Monterey and looked at different places, but there was big pushback coming mainly from the Monterey Sardine fishermen, which at that point was a fairly newly developing industry. It was beginning to take off after 1915, and those guys were convinced that those sardines were coming into the bay because of these whales. They were chasing them into the bay, which of course wasn't necessarily the case. But they backed off, and they finally opened their station over in 1919 over in Moss Landing, operated there until about 1926. So they were, and as I said, those guys are really good at what they did. Anybody here know when the last whaling station closed in California? Anybody have any guess? 1973 in Richmond. So it was Del Monte Foods, actually, was their cannery, their whale food, mostly for dog food, cat food, that kind of thing. So all of us in this room, I can safely say, have all used whaling products at one time or another. All right. So Chinese fishermen arriving here in the early 1850s. This is a photograph taken in 1874. This is the Chinese village in Pacific Grove, where Hopkins Marine Station, Monterey Bay Aquarium is today. If you look at this photograph, what do you notice in the front there? Kids, right? Those kids were born here, American citizens. In the early 1850s, a small group of Chinese fishermen and their families sailed across the North Pacific in 3 small 30-foot junks, actually a series of currents that will push them all the way across. Chinese call that the black tide, or the big drain. Comes out somewhere near Cape Mendocino, Northern California, turned right, stayed on the California coast, overshot Monterey into Mexico, turned around and fight these currents back. They finally land out of Point Lobos. I am assuming all of you went out to Point Lobos? So you all know Point Lobos is the center of the universe, right? They're taken in by a Rumsian village, the native people of Monterey, who nursed these guys back to health. When they got healthy, looked out to that bay out there, and they said, hey, there's nobody fishing out there. And the reason nobody was fishing out there, because at that time there was no way to get fresh fish to the big markets like San Francisco, because the railroad hadn't arrived here yet. The Chinese understood the technology of, and this is a big deal, understood the technology of just drying all of their catch, would dry all of their fish, and once a month or so, this big Chinese junk would come down from San Francisco, pick up all this dried fish, ship back to China. They're shipping to other Chinese camps along the west coast here, but they were also selling fresh fish to the local citizens here in Monterey, so they actually brought an economy here. The next year, 1954, another wave came settled right about where the Monterey Bay Aquarium is today. Hopkins Marine Station became the largest Chinese fishing village on the West Coast, and they fished for everything that was out there. You name it, they fished it out there, including sardines, including rockfishes, everything. Jellies was a big thing. Kelp, they were collecting kelp, drying the kelp, shipping it back to China. In fact, I was told that the kelp from Monterey was particularly prized in China for the flavor of soup that it made, which I have to tell you I have tried, and it is an acquired taste. 1874, this guy arrives. In fact, I'll show you this. I've done this before. Let me see if I can do this right. So here it is right here. So this key right here, this very key that I'm holding in my hand, changed the history of Monterey forever. This is a switch lock key from the Southern Pacific Railroad. This is the key that opened the lock, that pushed the track, that brought the train to Monterey. My great-grandfather was the conductor on the Southern Pacific. So now I got a railroad, now I got to get fresh fish to big market like San Francisco. I got the folks coming to fish in Monterey, and particularly the Italians, not the Sicilians yet, but the Genovese coming across the bay from Santa Cruz, coming down from San Francisco to fish primarily for rockfish. So the Chinese, who actually wanted to compete with those guys, said, well, hey, we'll just fish for squid at night, because nobody wanted squid then. Squid was considered to be a junk fish. So the Italians are home sleeping, the Chinese are out fishing for squid. Also, the Southern Pacific, actually, the original railroad that came in 1874 was a locally owned railroad called the Monterey Salinas Valley Railroad. They built that little road so they could ship fish to San Francisco, veg to Salinas Valley, and to attract tourism to the Monterey area. But they were not financially very successful. They were bought out in 1880 by the Southern Pacific. When the Southern Pacific bought that little road out, they also bought about 8,000 acres of the Monterey Peninsula. They had this funny, kind of quirky idea they could turn Monterey into a tourist paradise. Who thinks such a thing, right? All these tourists coming to Monterey, well, I have a place for them to stay. So we built this beautiful hotel here called the Hotel Del Monte. And what this beautiful hotel was, you all know this hotel, right? And that this hotel really was, they actually, by the way, built this hotel in 3 months. It opened in June of 1880. And what this hotel really was is what they called a winter hotel. Marked hotel to the rich folks that lived in Boston and Philadelphia, New York. Hey, get all those cold winters, come to Monterey. Spend a couple of months at the Hotel Del Monte. A lot of folks would do that. Now all these folks come to stay in there. And imagine that too. Imagine having to come across the United States in 1880 by train. I mean, it was the Wild West out there. I mean, they came to California. It was a big deal. They come to California, come to Monterey. You're staying at the Hotel Del Monte. All these tourists staying there. They got stuff for them to do. So they created that 17-mile drive, which, by the way, was never 17 miles. And what you did then is you went to the hotel kitchen, they packed you a beautiful lunch, and you went by horse and buggy around old Monterey, looking at all the old adobes, and usually your first stop would be the custom house right over here, and the Monterey Wharf, and the whale fishery, where you got to smell dead whale. Then you continue on the waterfront into the Chinese fishing village, where you usually ate your lunch, smell dried squid. Then continue on what we now call the Asilomar into the current 17-mile drive, which today is about 14 miles, all the way up to the Carmel Mission, and all the way back to the hotel. It took all day and 18 miles. So they had that. They had beautiful gardens and all kinds of games. They had art galleries and polo and golf. And they had sport fishing out in the Monterey Bay. And they worked with this gentleman right here. The guy, if you're on your right there, a guy named Emmanuel Duarte. Duarte family owned a number of businesses along this Monterey waterfront. The kids of that tourist trade. This is just one of his many businesses. His marine museum, glass bottom boats, fishing tackle. You can see the abalone shells and dried sea stars he sung to the tourists here. He was a taxidermist. Whalebone products down there. That's whalebone vertebrae with a Carmel Mission painted on it. In fact, you can go to the Carmel Mission today and actually see that piece there. Whalebone chair. I've sat in this chair. Not very comfortable. They had a number of businesses along the waterfront. They would actually work with the sport fishermen who come and stay at the Hotel Del Monte. They actually work with the commercial fishermen who would work with the sport fishermen who come and stay at the Hotel Del Monte. And what they would do, because those guys, these commercial fishermen, really weren't making a lot of money in how they were fishing out on the bay, especially for salmon. They were using hand lines and they were using gill nets. And gill nets was the net you stretch across your boat. The fish in the net get caught by their gills, hence the name gill net, which really wasn't the most effective way to catch salmon out in the bay out there. These guys were not making a lot lot of money, and so in order to make ends meet, they worked with Mr. Duarte, who acted kind of like an agent for these commercial fishermen, and he'd, no pun intended here, hook them up with those sport fishermen who come to stay at the Hotel Del Monte. They take them out of the bay, and they show them the good place to fish for salmon out in the bay. They're a fishing guides like you would do in Europe. This is a wonderful photograph of a Monterey sport fisherman taken about 1900 or so with his big, beautiful king salmon right there. More sport fishermen out there in the bay or on the wharf there with their big, beautiful king salmon. I love the guy in the middle there with the hat, and he must have been the designated driver. He's got those goggles on there. Yeah, and then this wonderful photograph, and the guy on the right there in the hat is a guy named J. Parker Whitney. Behind Mr. Whitney was about 30. He was a very, very wealthy man. He and his two brothers made a lot of money selling supplies with the original 49ers. Guys coming to California for the gold rush. They also raised a special breed of sheep. Time he's about 30, he just spent the rest of his life traveling the world, doing the things that he loved, which was hunting and fishing. He spent a lot of time here in Monterey, staying at the Hotel Del Monte, fishing salmon out in the bay out there. He's the guy, this guy right here, who introduced the idea of fishing salmon out bay with a rod and reel, and fishing it with a trolling line, which is a line with a lot of hooks on it. You drag through the water, which is a really effective way to catch salmon out in that bay. So our Monterey commercial fishermen said, wait a minute, we can do that. And they have salmon landing records to go back to that time, and you can see it. In 1893, they caught maybe 5,000 pounds worth of salmon. Then they switched to trolling technology. In 1895, they caught over 95,000 pounds worth of salmon in that bay out there. That is a lot of fish. This is a mailer that's sent out by the Hotel Del Monte to entice these sport fish to come back to the hotel. The guy on the reel there with a fishing rod there is Mr. Whitney, and the guy in the front, the fisherman at the bow or at the back of the boat there is a guy named Louis Perez, who was then known as the Fish King. He was such a good fisherman. He used to hold dinners at the Hotel Del Monte, selling stock into his fishing company. This is the back end of that mailer they send out. What I love about this, it says, look at all the things we caught today. Come back to the hotel. We got salmon, sea trout, sea bass, tuna, rock cod, barracuda. Those are mostly warm water fishes that aren't normally found in that bay out there, which tells me there was what we call that El Nino going at that time, which is that warming current that happens every so many years. In fact, we're having one right now that brings in these warm water fishes. But again, what makes this document so remarkable isn't that, but it's this. It's this drawing of a salmon rig that was developed by Mr. Whitney that literally revolutionized the fishing industry, the salmon fishing industry in Monterey here. So, 1882, the United States passed a law called the Chinese Exclusion Act, essentially meaning that Chinese laborers are no longer allowed to immigrate into the United States. A law, I might add, that was on the books in this country until the 1940s. But what that law did was open the doors for other immigrants to come into California, Monterey in very large numbers. In particular, the Japanese began to arrive here. The Japanese that came were fishermen. They were good fishermen. Many of them were graduates of Fisheries College of Japan. They brought new skills and new technology with them. These guys came here not for sardine, but for salmon. Salmon was king. Salmon was the big money fish in Monterey at that time. Here is, and actually in California. These are a couple of Japanese fishermen with their net. This is right near the Monterey Wharf. You can see a little boardwalk behind them. That was a little wooden boardwalk. It actually wrapped its way all around the Monterey waterfront, from the Hotel Del Monte all the way around to the Monterey Wharf. That'd be a wonderful thing. She still have that thing here. That'd be a nice thing. So these are Japanese fishermen. These are more Japanese fishermen also close to the Monterey Wharf, also with their nets right there. Japanese fishermen fishing salmon out in the bay out there. So as I mentioned, these guys came here to fish salmon. To give you an idea of how big this was, in 1909, at the end, when this picture was taken, at the end of that 1909 salmon season, there were 100, the Monterey Daily Cypress, and by the way, the salmon season lasted 3 months. May 15th to August 15th, the Monterey Daily Cypress, which was the local newspaper at that time, reported at the end of that 1909 salmon season there were 185 salmon boats working in Monterey Bay. 145 of them were Japanese-owned, catching an average of 1 million pounds of king salmon in 3 months. 1 million! This 1909 salmon season, they caught 1,500,000 pounds of salmon in that bay out there. In the 1910 season, they caught over 2 million pounds of king salmon in that bay out there. That is a lot of fish. This Japanese fishermen holding their king salmon at the Monterey Wharf, again this is early, about 1905 or so. Here they are unloading again. You can see the big salmon at the wharf. This is taken in 1909 in a great that was a big season, 1909 season for them. In fact, it was so big, they actually held a big party afterwards. This is at the end of the 1909 salmon season. They had a whole festival down on the Monterey Wharf. They had fireworks, and people decorated the wharf with Japanese lanterns, and this is all the fishermen in their boats, and you can see a band in front there in the boat. They were so excited about all the salmon they were catching in the bay at that time. That got the attention of this guy. This is a guy named Frank Booth. Frank Booth was in the salmon business up along the Sacramento River in the 19th century. In the late 19th century, the salmon business really was up along the northern part of California, up along the Sacramento River, and they weren't doing that well then. There was a depression going on in this country. They weren't catching a lot of salmon, and they heard these big lands going on in Monterey, and so all these processors formed this co-op called the Sacramento River Packers Association, and sent Mr. Booth, probably because he was the youngest guy, I don't know, sent him down here to Monterey, check it out. He comes down and goes, oh man, this is great. Tried to get contracts with Japanese fishermen. They said, well, you got a good contract to market in San Francisco. So he backs off a little bit, builds a little salmon shed near the Monterey Wharf. In between that time, the city of Monterey leases a piece of property right next to the wharf to a guy named H.R. Robbins. And I've seen Mr. Robbins' lease. Now, Robbins is an interesting guy. He was from the Oakland area of California. He was actually in the food business. He was actually produced cereals. At that time, around the late 19th century, they're beginning to really experiment with this idea of reduction, where they're taking the heads, tails, and offal of the fish, and they were grinding up for other products, animal feeds, fertilizers, that kind of thing. He was interested in getting to that business. And so he came down to Monterey because of the fishing industry going down here, and he leases a piece of property right next to the Monterey Wharf. And I've seen Mr. Robbins' lease. It actually says on his lease, for the purposes of sardine cannery, reduction plant, dance hall. He also sold sea lions to the circuses. Needs to say that Mr. Robbins was not only not the greatest businessman, but Booth was able to watch this whole reduction thing going on, and he was really not really impressed with it. He was concerned about this whole idea of reduction. He just thought it was just too darn easy, and it would deplete the fishery too quickly. He was pretty forward-thinking in this way. But he eventually bought out Robbins Cannery in 1903, got contract to Japanese fishermen, began to can salmon as a big fishery, and then began to experiment with these large sardines that are appearing in the bay at the end of the salmon season. He needed sardine fish at this point because most of the Japanese were leaving Monterey into that salmon season to go work in the ag fields in the Central Valley of California, only to return in the spring to fish salmon. And also, as I'm sure you guys are all aware, at the turn of the 20th century, a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment in this country, coming primarily from Caucasian workers who convinced the Japanese to come and take their job, which really wasn't the case. But in 1905, Mr. Booth said to the local newspaper, "Not going to hire any more Japanese." Easy call for him because he didn't really mean it. He was still going to buy salmon for those guys when he turned into spring. But that instant, he sent for these Sicilian fishermen who already worked for him up along the Sacramento River to come down here to Monterey, start fishing sardine here as a small secondary fishery in the fall and winter months. Salmon was king. Salmon was the big money fish. It was Japanese fishermen that were doing it. So where's all that salmon going? Here is a photograph. This is salmon being processed on the wharf. They weren't actually canning it here. They were bringing it in, and then they would actually crate it up, and then it would be shipped. Again, that's crated salmon. This is also about 1909 when these pictures were taken. Put on a wagon, taken to the train station, load onto the train, then it'd be shipped up to Pittsburgh, California, where Booth had canneries up there, and it was essentially being pickled, what they were doing with it. And they were shipping it to Europe. It was going mainly to Germany. Most of that salmon was going in. In those days, all the sardines were eating in this country then, mainly coming from Europe, coming primarily from France. France was the big sardine producer at the turn of the 20th century. And by the way, the Monterey sardine, I may make this point, is the Monterey sardine was never a popular fish to eat. People thought it was too early. There was a time at this time in the turn of the 20th century, and people ate sardines almost on a daily basis. It's like today we eat potato chips. people ate sardines. It was just something they did every day, but they were used to eating these sardines from the North Atlantic, from Europe, from France, also sardines from New York State and Maine. Those little guys, that's what they were used to. Not all sardines are the same, right? I just showed you that big sardine, which is actually called the pilchard, or the true sardine. So they were shipping all these, so they weren't really making that much money in the sardine business. All this salmon going to Europe. And as I mentioned, Mr. Booth was doing an experiment with all these little sardines that were being, these large sardines being to appear in the bay at the turn of the sardine season. He brought these Sicilian fishermen in. These guys came in, they got their own technology in here with a net called a Lampara net, and began to fish. And they also were working with purse seine nets, early purse seine, beach seine, other purse seine nets. This is a wonderful photograph taken just right in front of the museum here on the beach that was there at one time of an early Sicilian fisherman with his 3 daughters on his brand new Lampara boat. I just think that's a wonderful photograph. And they began to fish sardine. This is another wonderful photograph taken also about 1906 or so of Sicilian fishermen fishing sardine right in the middle of the harbor. They have a purse seine net, and you can see all the fish in the net and how this net operates. It's got lead weights on the bottom. It's got floats on the top. And this is a photograph of some of the floats they use. This is a glass bottle. You can see it has a rounded bottom on it. In those days, you put a carbonated beverage in the bottle. It's upright. The carbonation will pop the cork. But it's on its side, it doesn't have that problem. And so they would use these bottles as floats. But they would fill these bottles with beer, cork them, use them as floats to float their nets in the cold water of Monterey Bay. They're done fishing. They pull off the floats. They had cold beer. Pretty smart. So early Sicilian fishermen unloading their sardines up in, this is at the Booth Cannery right in front of the wharf over there, about 1909 or so. This is a label for the Monterey Fishing and Canning Company. This is the first cannery that was on what we now call Cannery Road, then was Ocean View Avenue. This was a Japanese-owned cannery, owned by a guy named Otto Sabaru Noda. He had an American partner, a guy named Harry Malpas, and this is one of their labels, California sardines. It says cooked in olive oil, which they called the French method. It's hot, bubbling oil, right? Olive oil, peanut oil, it's where they get French fries, right? And so they were cooking their sardines in this hot, bubbling oil, and then marketing them, get across the country. Again, they weren't all that popular. They weren't making a lot of money at this in these early days. This cannery operated between 1902 to about 1907, and when they sold it to the Monterey Fish Company, who took it over. So when they first began to market these fish, they figured no one's going to buy them. This is the first national ad for Monterey Sardines. Appears in a Sears and Roebuck catalog in 1905. If you look down here, being advertised, South Royal Mackerel. Sousing is sort of a pickling spices, sort of what they were using, and so they were calling these Monterey mackerel. But even in 1905, the federal government said, you can't call those mackerels. They're not mackerel, those are sardines. So they marketed these fish initially to the African-American communities as salmon sardines and market them to the Jewish communities as herring sardines. They tried a variety of things to sell this product. They would produce these beautiful recipe books like this one right here. You go down to the cannery, they'd give you one, they would mail you one, or oftentimes you bought canned products. Those days you bought it by the case, they'll put it in the case. There's all these wonderful recipes for sardine sandwiches and sardine rarebits and sardine salad. My favorite, though, is sardine jello salad made with lime jello, chili sauce, Monterey sardines, which I actually have made a few times, and not that bad. So this is a brochure for a French sardine company. As I mentioned, most of the sardines they're eating in this country were, really? Jeez, really? All right, I have to hurry up. You said I only have 5 minutes, so I'm never going to get to where I want to go. So let's skip all this stuff. This French label, I'll do like this part. So this was about 1905 or so, and it said, notwithstanding the bad fishing season, since the failure of the crats and sardines on the French coast, just like here in California, the sardines also disappeared off the French coast. They just do that. They run in these cycles. An enormous quantity of foreign fish has been imported in France and fraudulently labeled French. Insist on having the French sardine. So they were the ones who produced this French sardine, the whole idea of the French method. So here's what happened. World War I, right? 1914, World War I breaks out in Europe. What does that do? It cuts off all that salmon going to Europe, all those sardines coming for Europe, and they just switched, began to heavily fish sardine along the west coast here. There were sardine canneries in New York State and Maine, but those guys couldn't fish because there were German submarines out there in the Atlantic. In 1915, there were maybe 60 or so Sicilian fishermen here, 2 canneries operating. At the end of World War I, 1919, there were 9 full-time sardine canneries here along the Monterey waterfront down there, and almost 400 Sicilian fishermen here in Monterey. And because they couldn't get those market fish, those in the North Atlantic, the Monterey sardine really opened that market, and people began to buy them. But still, it wasn't all that popular, so they needed to find a way to market it. People weren't used to those big sardines. 1915, the California welcomes the world. This is a postcard for the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition, a World's Fair that opens in San Francisco. You all been to San Francisco, right? So the Palace of Fine Arts, built for that World's Fair, right? In fact, they filled in that. It was like 650 acres was all filled in to build this World's Fair. 20 million people attended this fair here. We'll take a ticket. We're going to go into the fair here. Here's our little ticket. There's a picture of entrance to the fair there. And then that's the California State Building, which was the largest of the state buildings. Every state was represented. This is the largest of the state buildings. This was 5 acres in size. Every county is represented. This is Monterey County's exhibit. What I love about this is all the abalone. They're really promoting abalone. Every exhibit case has abalone shells in it. You can even see the abalone diver in the case right there. You can see it from the back. It's all Point Lobos Abalone Canning Company all over there. And then this. I found this card actually on eBay, and this was many years ago actually, and it's for the Booth Sardine Cannery, and I saw it, and I'd never seen a business card before, so I put a bid in it, but I was disappointed because somebody had written on it, and I couldn't actually read what it was written on it, but when I got the card, I can now see it says, in your U.S. Fisheries Food Products Building Exposition. That's from the point 1915 World's Fair where Monterey sardines were introduced to the world, right there. So here is a photograph inside the food product building. This is a picture. The fair adopted this couple that was going to get married. And here is a photograph of all the stuff that was being given to them as wedding gifts. And if you look way down there on the bottom there on the left, you can see Booth Sardines. They got 2 cases of Monterey sardines for the thing right there. All right, so just for this is where it gets. So the Monterey Sardine Fishery eventually becomes the largest fishery of a single fish in the history of the United States, right? And so the big money, as I mentioned, wasn't in the canned products. The big money was in the byproducts. They had learned early on that the Monterey sardine produced a lot of oil and a lot of meal, a lot of fish meal. And California Fish and Game saw this early on too, and they were very concerned about this. So in 1917, they actually were able to get a legislation passed called the Fair Market Act that essentially said that you had to prove that the sardine that you were canning, you had to prove that it was unfit for human consumption before you could use it as byproducts, so go into that reduction process. They could take some, they could take up to 25%. To get above that 25%, they had to prove that the fish was unfit for human consumption. Well, in 1917, these guys, there was no real pushback coming from the cannery owners or from the fishermen because they were making money. People were buying these sardines because the only sardines they could get were the sardines coming from California, so they didn't really care. 1919, when the war ends, and all of a sudden these North Atlantic fisheries begin to reopen. It still takes about a year, but once they start to reopen, start selling the North Atlantic sardines, there's a pushback. People began to buy those North Atlantic sardines and stopped buying the Monterey sardine, California sardine, and the price dropped dramatically. In fact, they were losing money on this business, and so they began heavily into the reduction process and began to produce into the oil into the fish meal, in particular chicken feed. So next time you guys all go to the market, you buy a chicken, you can thank this guy right here for that chicken. Because prior to 1920, the chicken industry in the United States wasn't doing very well. People didn't eat chicken like we do today. You know, it was kind of expensive. They began to produce this cheap chicken. See, the head, tail, and off of the Monterey sardine. The chickens loved it, thrived on it. More and more chickens were being produced. Price of chicken went down. People began to buy chickens. My friend Bill Ripley, who was a retired biologist at the California Department of Fish and Game, used to say that Foster Farms chicken owes its life to the bones of the Monterey sardine. Right, so you tell me I'm done here? Is that it? Did I really go 45 minutes?
You got 1 minute.
Really? Man. So 1 minute I can do it. So, Fish and Game, they really going heavily into this business. There were three companies operating. There were three companies in Monterey in the 1920s: Carmel Canning Company, the Bayside Fish and Flour Company, and Monterey Fish Products Company. Most of those, they were really into the reduction process. They began to heavily produce more and more of this reduction process. 1924, the California Department of Fish and Game took these guys to court in Salinas. There was a trial went on for several days, actually, in Salinas in September, and they had scientists all went back and forth, and they're all saying that this, and of course the defense, these guys, the cannery owners, were all saying, well, there's tons of sardine out there. We can't deplete this industry. And of course, Fish and Game were saying the opposite. That was their big concern. One of their star witnesses for the state, for the prosecution, was F.E. Booth of the F.E. Booth Canning Company. As I mentioned earlier, he was very resistant to this idea of reduction. He actually testified on their behalf. He actually said while he was being interviewed that while he was being examined, he actually said that the sardine could go the way of the American buffalo and the carrier pigeon. He was so concerned about this. But he also admitted in cross-examination that he was losing money in the canned products, and that he was making money because he was also doing the reduction process, but he was staying pretty much at that level he was supposed to stay at. So of course the judge ruled in favor of the processors for the defense and said, there's lots of sardines out there. You can't prove there's not, and that opened those doors. And there's actually a lot more to this, and I can't get to it, so you'll have to just wait till next time. So thank you very much.
A big hand for Tim Thomas. Remember, walking tours during Whale Fest, walking tours, what is that, first Saturday of the month?
Yeah, well, I also do camera walking tours
almost
on a daily basis.
Okay. On a daily basis.